Welcome, Thenmozhi. I'm so happy to have you here to talk with us in Yoga Changemaker magazine about your work and about your book, The Trauma of Caste, a Dalit feminist meditation on survivorship, healing, and abolition. If you don't have this book, go and get it. If you are in the yoga world in any way, you need to have it and reflect, read, and talk with your community about it. Thenmozhi, I know that this book has been like a lifetime of work, and so I want to just begin with asking what led up to you writing it at this time.
Well, it is definitely, it took me only a year to write, but actually it is a reflection that comes from a lifetime of being caste oppressed. And I think, like everybody, during the pandemic, there was a moment of just deep despair.
Mm,
I was seeing increasing polarization. We went from, for those of us that are South Asian, the pandemic actually began much earlier for us because we actually opened with a genocide. The largest genocide in world history was launched right at the end of 2019. And then it was genocide, pandemic, then an uprising, and then a coup.
mm,
And there's so much hatred, so much polarization, so much division. And I just felt like there had to be another way. As someone who's been fighting and organizing, I would see us win. And then I would see us, be retracted back by the fragility and the cycles of violence that kind of keep us locked into unending suffering. And that was a big reason why I wanted to slow down and think deeply about if there was another way forward.
mm,
And it became even more meaningful for me because my mom was diagnosed as terminal
mm.
at the beginning of the pandemic. Her kidneys failed. And, if you've ever been into a dialysis center, it's all Black and brown bodies, and, kidney failure is a result of high blood pressure, diabetes, these stress related conditions. And so you see these like, amazing elders whose bodies have been broken by capitalism and the system, just
Mm,
kind of abandoned, even after they've dedicated their lives to servicing and being part of the foundation that allows the privilege to do their things. So I think for me, watching her struggle for life
mm,
really made me think about how can I ensure that I do everything to choose life in the
mm.
face of these dominator systems that are essentially a death cult to our species and the planet, and think about ways that we might heal from it,
Yeah.
especially through my lens as a caste depressed person.
Yes. I'm so sorry that your mom and you had to go through that. And yeah, just with you and feeling that burden that is disproportionate, particularly for folks of color, for Black and brown folks. I think it's something like 60%, more likely to die of heart disease or diabetes or those types of diseases for particularly South Asian and Black and Latin folks. But it's not just statistics, right? And also I want to say, and I want to ask you in a moment to explain what caste is, because some of our listeners may not know. Um, but oppression is multiplicative. And so it's not just South Asians, right? We're not in any way all a monolith. There's layers of privilege and oppression within the community that gets labeled as South Asian or as brown or even as Black. And so those health outcomes are probably vastly, vastly increased even the more oppressions we're talking about. So what is caste oppression? And can you explain that to folks who are new to that concept?
Sure. So caste is a system of exclusion analogous to race. It has its origins in 2000 BC, where in Hindu scriptures, you had, the priestly caste basically write these scriptures that set themselves up at the top of a hierarchical pyramid. And like race, created this social fiction that said they were the top and the most pure, and every other caste below them was less pure and deserved lesser jobs. So you have Brahmins at the tops, you have warriors and rulers next, you have merchants in the middle, peasants at the bottom. And then outside of this whole system, we're a group of people who were deemed spiritual criminals,
Mm,
people who had done bad conduct in past lives, and
mm,
as a result deserve to be put aside from society, to be shunned, and to be given the worst of jobs, to live in the most filthiest of places, and were seen as untouchable, because if you were to touch them, you would be spiritually defiled.
mm.
And that was my community. And of course, no one gets to, decide our role and our place before the divine. So we reject that term untouchable, and we call ourselves Dalit or caste oppressed, or any of the other religions people may have tried to, convert to escape that initial influx of caste designation.
Mm,
And I think what's important for non-South Asians to know is that this is one of the core soul wounds for anyone who's of South Asian origin and comes from any of those countries, whether it's Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, or the indentured communities like Indo-Fijian and Indo-Caribbean. However, what's very interesting is that I think when we immigrate to places like the United States, we're racialized under white supremacy. But as you talked about, Susanna, that is a very tenuous category that we're all shoved into. And once we're racialized, none of that other historical trauma goes away. We're
mm.
still dealing with the ramifications of caste and the tensions related to language and other historical violences, whether it's related to the divisions of our countries, which we call partition,
Mm,
or our own series of genocides, of which we've had many. So it's a real challenge, because healing for our community is both addressing the wounds we have from white supremacy, but we must also address the wounds we have from caste. And I call that the caste soul wound.
mm.
And to work on that, we have to really dismantle where we see this animating ideology that helped to establish caste, which is called Brahmanism.
Yeah.
So just like we don't talk about anti-Blackness without white supremacy, when we talk about caste, we talk also about Brahmanism and the need to de-Brahmanize institutions that have lineages connected to the oppression of caste oppressed people. And
Yeah.
all dharmic traditions do, including yoga.
Yes, thank you so much for explaining that so clearly. And also, I want to highlight and point out something very important, which is that caste oppression did not start with British colonization. And that's something that I hear in particularly South Asian, but increasingly in white yoga communities or dominant culture yoga communities. That is just a lie, and is something you really in depth break down and explain and draw out in your book. Um, and so I'd love for you to share with us what has been the connection between yoga and caste, and also, how people today who maybe you're new at learning about this, or maybe you've known a little bit but you haven't been sure. And we'll talk about South Asian folks in a moment too. But how can folks get involved?
Sure. So caste is now found in all South Asian communities, and is also found in all communities of religious practice right now.
Mm,
So I think that what's really important is to know that this is a human rights struggle, it's a civil rights struggle, and there's an active movement from caste oppressed people all around the world for, fellow travelers of justice to acknowledge what violence has occurred on our bodies in dharmic traditions, and to also stand beside us as we fight for freedom. It's one of the reasons why we ask for people to make caste equity acknowledgments, which we can talk about later. But I think that, yoga traditions, are based on Hindu scripture and Hindu philosophy. And in that regard, there are many aspects to uh, some of the ways that we have seen Orthodox training be listed, where we see Brahminical traditions that are exclusive to caste oppressed people. And, in my book, I spend a lot of time kind of talking about how caste is laid out in general through Hindu scriptures, and they are painful. to read and to really witness with embodied reactions, right? You're some people who use the Bhagavad Gita, for example, in their yoga trainings, and that's a text that is deeply casteist and dehumanizes many Dalits in the ways that it speaks about the duties of different castes, you
Mm,
know, and but I also think that for me, I was a really active yoga practitioner in my 20s, and I left yoga because of the
mm,
exclusiveness of certain
mm,
spaces. So some of the things I think people can look at is the heavy reliance on Sanskrit mantras in
mm,
yoga practice. Very few people know this that are not South Asian, but you know, Sanskrit as a language was forbidden to be spoken and listened to by caste oppressed people. That was actually one of the things in one of the Hindu scriptures. And so I always found it incredibly violent to be forced to chant those things because I would think, oh my God, you know, my ancestor could not say these words. How can I use these words in a freeing way? You know, and so that fetishization of Sanskrit was very triggering and I think not really applicable because the reality is that you know, the process of mind body integration has been around as long, you know, as the first ape became an upright human. You know, this is part of what we do to be connected with the earth, with other species, and with each other. But as it became, yoga became written down, it's been, there's a way to kind of revere those texts as if they are the only path towards integration. And I
mm,
think Sanskrit is part of that. And so usage of Sanskrit and forcing students to use Sanskrit is really harmful. And I want to encourage more experimentation around that. I
mm,
also think there is a lot of painful processes around how the body is gendered
mm,
and the framework of purity and pollution within that context. So I remember being in this one yoga class and this yoga teacher talking about how our senses were Shakti
mm,
and had gone to, you know, some session in Varanasi and someone was saying how, you know, our senses Shakti was a whore because she's always looking around, trying to be around. And so you had to train her, you had to discipline her. And he like made this movement with his hand and you discipline her with the action of Shiva, which
mm,
is yogic practice. And I just thought this was not an inherently freeing or liberatory framework.
mm,
I also think it's a false binary. We you
mm,
know we want to be sensuous beings and we want to be integrated beings. There's just a different time, an intentionality around that. So that approach, which is so judgmental, was really infuriating. And
mm,
even the stuff around the Ida and the Pingala, where we have gendered ideas of, you know, the forceful Nadi and, you know, the feminine yin part of, you
mm,
know, the moon Nadi, right? Those things I think can be qualities without ascribing them to gender,
mm,
right? And especially because there is this sense that, you know, again, like if you think about Western society being really driven by the sinner and the whore
mm,
complex, right? The sinner and the saint. Purity and pollution is often what you talk about in yoga, right? We're
mm,
always detoxifying, we're trying
mm,
to get things out, right? And there's this real competitive, like aggressive nature about getting the dross out. And that framework of pollution doesn't have to be there, you know, because it, you know, all of our systems in nature are self-balancing, right? And when you think
mm,
about the body and its power to kind of keep wanting to return to homeostasis, this idea of forcefully shifting things that are bad
mm,
versus those things that are good, they're not reflective of nature. I think it was reflective of one person's filter of how they interpreted through the values of that time. But
mm,
when I would hear purity and pollution, it would take me right back to being someone who is caste depressed because my entire existence was considered polluting, you know? So how much asana would I have to do in order to finally be accepted? Do you know
mm,
what I mean? So it's almost like we have to be so careful with our words because much of yoga teacher training oftentimes replicates Brahminical dogmatism. So you can't question your teacher, you can't question the practice. But I really want to encourage everyone that surrender on the mat is not the surrender of consent, and it's
mm,
not the surrender of your moral center, and
mm,
it's not the surrender of your critical thinking.
mm,
I think so many times, like we see abuse in yoga studios because people believe that the only way to run a yoga practice is through these dogmatic ways. And when you create conditions where people can't question, where consent is being overridden, it's very easy to see abuse.
Mm. Yes, thank you for all of those tools. And I want to kind of highlight, you talked about consent as really critical and also degendering in yoga. And there's a way that that goes with the harm of like patriarchal Brahmanism. I often think of it as one of the first appropriations of some of these early traditions, like yoga, like Buddhism, Jainism, that were, and I'm not, it's so hard to know because a lot of it is oral tradition through colonial violence and different violences, it's been lost. But when I, when I tune into what the intention of liberation and freedom is, it's for all. And anything that separates anyone else out from having access to that is, to me, is a misunderstanding or a deliberate misinterpretation for the purpose of oppression and power. And that sometimes we do have to go against what we're taught, or we do have to go against the way it's been done for hundreds, or thousands of years. One of my teachers is uh, a former Brahmin in Bihar who specifically teaches Dalit folks who want to be taught either Buddhist practices or yoga practices, whatever they request. And he's not out in the public because his work, he would be attacked by many different folks, other Hindu nationalists. And so I bring that up to say, like, for folks who don't know, this is dire. It's not just ideological. It's like people's lives are on the line now. And it's not just a spiritual debate, it's actual life or death. And so, yeah, I want to say I have a lot of gratitude for your fortitude, Thenmozhi, through the years of doing the work that you've done. And I wanted to ask about like your activist background and also your spiritual practices that allow you to do the work of speaking up about caste, because there are so many geopolitical forces that are trying to silence the work that you and other caste abolitionists are doing, which is part of why we need to also speak up as allies and accomplices.
Well, it was really interesting because I think I was born a caste abolitionist out of my mother's womb. There's so much resistance and resilience in my family. But I think that, it really took writing this book to kind of weave all the strands of my activism, because I've certainly done socially engaged art. I am an advocate and an organizer. And, our organization, Equality Labs, is one of the largest Dalit civil rights organizations in the United States. And we've spearheaded this movement to have caste equity be in all American institutions. And so we're asking folks to add caste as to their non-discrimination policy so that all places can be welcoming for all folks. But I've also been a religious seeker.
Mm.
And I think that this book really helped me kind of bring all of myself together, because I think for a long time I couldn't admit, that I was a survivor of religious abuse.
Mm.
And fundamentally, when we're talking about caste, that's exactly what it is, because you're not just excluded like on a political and economic level, you are told that you're spiritually defiling.
Mm.
And there's something that's irrevocably broken in your heart when you're born to that. So the process of reclamation in terms of dignity and your sense of presence and your right to be an agent of spiritual possibility, that's a tremendous thing to have to take back for yourself.
Mm.
And, that's why I say, like, I had stages to my activism, but it took
Mm.
really writing this book, being in deep meditation with myself and members of my community, to
Mm.
be able to say, we have this right in all domains to be free. And I think that, I structured the book around 4 meditations because I walk people through considering what the caste soul wound feels like on the individual level, on the interpersonal level, in structures, and then fundamentally in the ultimate failure of the law of life, how does it contribute to genocide?
Mm.
And it's a journey that really, I feel, ancestrally, our ancestors are walking with us when you read that book, because you see that there's a wisdom that goes beyond just one lifetime,
Yeah.
because we've seen it, we've survived it, and we don't want to pass this on to the next.
Yes.
So it's a tremendous thing to really consider. How do we choose life? How
Mm.
do we stand with those who are fighting for the light, and let freedom come to all beings.
Yes.
That is a moment, I think, that is uniquely available to us, because when we start to see all things kind of fall apart, which is kind of the moment that we're in, like, so many democratic structures are really kind of being held together by bubblegum and toothpicks. We still have a choice about
Mm.
how we're going to turn the future, if we're able to, activate our radical imaginations,
Mm.
further than what, oppressive systems like white supremacy and Brahmanism really allow for us. And integrative practices like yoga are a crucial part of it, because
Mm.
for me, I face incredible violence for speaking out about the issue of caste. I faced death threats, I faced rape threats. My publisher was threatened
Mm.
for carrying this book, and there was all sorts of nasty messages they
Mm.
got and I got. And I even had to go into a safe house for several months last year because of, people being terrified at
Mm.
a Dalit person getting access to being able to speak about freedom.
Mm.
So for me, I think what's so important is that yoga practice and other integrative practices, the way I use them is that I'm not in a position where I can remove myself from violence, but I can learn how to attenuate its signal.
Mm.
And in many ways, I think that is the nimbleness that our nervous systems are going to require in this very kind of fraught time. We are going into a time when deeper polarization is breaking us all apart in all societies. So we have to have resilience. We have to be able to manage racial and caste and gender stress in order for us to rebuild the connections of humanness to bring us back to each other. And
Mm.
that's not easy work. It's incredibly difficult work, but it's the work that we do to turn our societies away from even more dangerous consequences like genocide and mass atrocity, and worse.
Yeah.
So it's a call of the moment. And I think while Dalit and caste oppressed and South Asian people, have a very particular experience because of what's happening in our homelands, we are
Mm.
seeing this issue and this lesson being mirrored all across democracies around the United States. We saw it with the coup here. Just a month ago, Bolsonaro and his folks tried to do it in Brazil. So there's a moment of madness that we must turn society away from.
Mm.
And this is the work of who we are as light workers, is to do the practices, be integrated, and view our liberation as linked. This isn't a transactional solidarity. This is
Mm.
shared liberation.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And for folks who haven't yet gotten the book, the energy and the sort of spiritual power that Thenmozhi is speaking of is throughout. And so I really felt like I was changed in many ways and will continue to be changed. It's not a book that you just read once. It's one that, because of the practices you have in there, I'm going to be going back to again and again and again, and also engaging in conversations with my family, with my communities, with other South Asian friends. And so what I want to ask you about, and it's kind of a two-part question, is a lot of the work that I started to do in the yoga world in the West was say, we have been excluded, South Asian folks, right, have been excluded in general from yoga in the West, and this makes no sense. Let's foreground us. That is missing the analysis of, Dalit folks are already excluded from yoga in India. And so there was a little bit of that analysis, but not at all in the mainstream. And so when we talk about cultural appropriation, and I think some of my work has contributed to this problem, is we go too far. And that can be South Asian folks, that can be allies, and accomplices who go in the direction of maybe inadvertently platforming a Hindu fundamentalist platform or caste exclusionary message around what yoga is. And so I really want to be clear as we can be with folks about how to both stand up to white supremacy, right, and get more representation, but not fall into caste oppression, because that's what we're furthering if we're not aware of this.
No, absolutely. And I think that, we are co-creating these cultures of liberation together. And it's really a mistake to think that, yogic and dharmic practices, in whatever tradition that you're in, aren't evolving with people who are practicing it in modern times, right? There's tons of things we don't do in yoga anymore, right? People are not putting iron rods in their butts or eating the cloth and then putting it back out. I mean, some people do, but we've moved on from that. We've also have been, through much power building, created spaces for, different body types and
Mhm.
adjusting for yoga positions for people who looked, who have different body structures, and also in terms of being open to BIPOC interpretations of yoga practice, right? And I think similar to that, we're in a moment right now where it is untenable to practice yoga and not have some acknowledgement of the harm in the lineage of the practice. And
Yes.
so I think one of the asks that I've been really, putting out there for people who are interested in really bringing their yoga practice in alignment with other movements for liberation is
Mm.
to offer a caste equity acknowledgement,
Mm.
and, it can start, of course, with, just acknowledging that, you are practicing a dharmic tradition that, you are using to, heal yourself and transform the world. And you also acknowledge that there was harm at the root of it.
Mm.
And so that in that respect, you acknowledge the harm that has occurred for millions of caste oppressed people over millennia, and you stand with their current struggles for freedom and wish
Mm.
them love and opening and all possibilities for freedom. Something as simple as that, right after your land acknowledgement and acknowledgements around racial justice is really crucial, because this is at the heart of getting to the way yoga has used sometimes to erase the struggles of caste oppressed and religious people. So it just really brings you back to center about what's important. The other thing that I think yogic practitioners can do is just on a practical level, add caste as a protected category
Mm.
to your non-discrimination clauses. Make sure that your yoga community is a safe place for all practitioners, and people know they can bring these kinds of questions to you as a teacher,
Mm.
and as a member. um, the other thing I think that's so important is that, you know I think it is okay for us to be iterative in our models for justice, because I hear a little bit of regret, in saying that you were part of, helping spin the needle too far, and the reality is that movements, I kind of think of them as like oceans, like waves that hit the bank, right? We have a first wave of folks that push a conversation, the water ebbs back, and then we move it a little bit further. And
Mm.
so that first attempt at really trying to deal with the Orientalism and the exclusionary parts of yoga that commodified and really tried to take away yoga from its South Asian practice, it needed to be remedied. We needed to
Mm.
have people who are from that context that are really shaping the practice. And also, and that is a necessary process of decolonization.
Mm.
And in our context, we have to also do the even further step to now de-Brahmanize it, and have teachers from all castes to have open conversations about these taboos, and also how yoga is used as a form of soft power to hide the violence that's happening around Hindu nationalism in its homeland of India.
Yes,
And,
and
you
International
know,
Yoga Day is a prime
exactly.
example of that. Yeah, and so many yoga students and practitioners don't realize that it's a tool of Hindu nationalism.
No, they're just excited to be like, oh my gosh, I'm someone who practices yoga and I want to celebrate it and do yoga with everyone, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually why it's so manipulative, that they're
Mm,
using this tool that people find so much health and integrative benefits to basically, put a velvet glove and an iron fist that's
mm,
actually putting millions of people at risk in India.
yeah.
So under Hindu nationalism. And so I think what's really important is that sanghas take that time to get connected, get aware to like what's happening on the ground. Especially if you're practicing a lineage that's directly related to India, you can't
Mm.
you can't separate the politics of that practice, because certainly the bad actors are not,
Yes. And this is
right?
like how yoga interacts with other national politics. It is so impactful, but we wherever you are, right? So for folks listening, it doesn't matter if you feel like there's no like caste, if you feel like, I'm in Dayton, Ohio, and there's no caste issues here, like that's not true. Caste is wherever folks are in the diaspora. Caste is everywhere, just like racism is everywhere. And we, each of us, needs to, from my view, as part of upholding ahimsa, or just believing in a spiritual practice that holds all of us as worthy of respect and a good life, we need to take these actions. And so I'm curious, I guess the deeper question I have is, I actually am not sure that a lot of the yoga spaces I'm in are ready to truly welcome Dalit, Adivasi, or caste oppressed folks in in a safe way. And meaning, I think there would be harm in a lot of these spaces. And so I wonder, one, about like, I think as an organizer, like how could there be a way to create more Dalit leaders if there was a desire for that in yoga spaces, Buddhist spaces, all the different spaces of wellness or spiritual leadership, and what can I or we do to support that so there could be safer spaces? Because just welcoming people in, I feel like there could be a lot of harm.
And also, I think that people have to really take that lesson of non-attachment, because, when you start to tweak people's yoga traditions or dharmic traditions, you're kind of, you're touching on something that's very tender, because it's something that's brought them opening. And
Mm.
they're worried that if you change even a small bit, the connection to the divine will be gone, right?
Mm.
And I think that's why it's so important for us to do this intentionally as a community. And, I think one of the things that, I was starting to work on was trying to figure out a way to create like a course,
Mm.
or either Yoga Teachers Alliance or some other training program where we can, one, help build caste equity competency for the field overall, and also think about ways that we can build more leaders from caste oppressed contexts. Because certainly for me, I left the yoga field because I
Yeah.
could not. I felt like I was in a yoga class, and I'm sure you felt this as a person of color and as a South Asian Susanna, where I was choosing, do I focus on myself and my practice, or do I transform an exclusionary practice? And that's really not a great choice, because you're always second to the work that has to be done around equity. And that's putting the burden on the excluded, right? So I
Right.
think we have to take a structural vision to this. We have to work on this as a field, and
Mm.
we have to experiment, because fundamentally many yoga traditions, they start with Sanskrit mantras. If you're asking people to replace mantras, you have to replace it with something else, right? And then you have to look at what is the actually alchemical process happening with mantras, right?
Mm.
You're like, in my understanding, the inner work that's happening is, on a physiological level, you're activating the vagus nerve, right?
Mm.
But there are things that are happening that are about integration of your systems. And I think being able to talk about those things secularly,
Mm.
out without adding mysticalness to things that are inherently exclusive, I think is the winnowing and the work that we have to do. And that comes, this is why I'm saying it's communities of practice, you know, because all mantras might not feel the same. Maybe you have to try something else. Maybe instead of the Bhagavad Gita, you read something from Thich Nhat Hanh's No Mud, No Lotus, you know.
Mhm.
There are many things that are liberatory and open that we might be able to start to, you know, switch into. And I think it all begins with that radical intention that we
Mhm.
want our yoga communities to be inclusive for all. And
Yeah.
if something that we're doing is barring even one person, we've already created harm.
Yeah.
So the idea that we're expanding our knowledge and connecting ourselves to each other, this is what happens when we learn of systems of exclusion and we work to root it up from ourselves. Like we might lose some privilege, but we actually gain our humanity and we gain back each other. You know, so you'll find a lot more caste oppressed people and religious minority folks and survivors of, you know, Brahmanism, because even in the dominant caste, and this is a big part of what I talked about, the
Mhm.
caste soul wound affects both the privileged and the oppressed. And
Mhm.
there is so much shame, so much guilt, so much, you know, just uh, training of the nervous system that has occurred in witnessing violence and not doing things about it,
Mhm.
the paralysis, you know, or even having been party to the violence, right? So it's these things, we don't want these things that limit us, that dehumanize us, because when you other another, you do dehumanize yourself, right?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much for your all your work and the spiritual wisdom that you're sharing as well as the political and social wisdom. And I'm wondering if there's anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like to share.
You know, I want to just encourage people to be able to question with empathy,
Mm,
you know, because I think sometimes the culture of, especially with the polarization that exists, oftentimes people feel like they can't speak up because they don't know enough. And also we've set up very kind of harsh divides so that we can't create cultures of inquiry and learning with each other because we're afraid to fail.
mm,
And also the divides feel too large to cross, you know, especially when the burden of the is falling on the excluded so frequently. There's a lot of deep resentment and pain. And I think that, you know, this is one of the reasons why I really relied on the work of thinkers like Ruth King and Rhonda McGee
mm,
around the way mindfulness can bring ease to things like racial and caste and gender stress. And
mm,
I adapted her model for caste stress, but it's a really good model for anyone looking at how can I train my nervous system for more resilience around these courageous conversations? Because, you know, the truth of what, you know, Respa Menachem, you know, this really beautiful Black Somatic abolitionist in Minneapolis said is that if we were going to solve racism through books and workshops, we would have already done it. But
mm,
there's a way that systems of oppression live in our body. They train our nervous systems. And it's that training that mindfulness practices and things like yoga practice can really help unwind, you
mm,
know, because we're not just training ourselves to be blissed out, you know, yoga bunnies, you know, who are on, you know, drinking green juice and living our lives, you know, we are here to be integrated individuals that are connected to the earth and each other in ways that transform our possibility towards justice.
mm,
And some of that requires us to unearth where we are afraid because of our privilege. And so the more that we can kind of bring attention to that conditioning and de-escalate it, the
mm.
better it helps us be allies to the movements that you know, we want to be connected to. And in all contexts, some of it, we all are people of privilege and people who have faced oppression. There's not like a binary where only an oppressed person or only a privileged person. We all have to do this work. It's what makes us integrated peoples, you know. So I would just say, I want to give permission to people to be curious, to
Mm,
ask questions, especially around this issue, because you're not hurting people's feelings. You're actually breaking the silence and helping to erase the taboo that has surrounded this conversation. And there might be people who try to make you feel bad about it, or who try to say, oh, this is like reverse racism. And I
mm,
want to assure you, those are people who are bigots. Those are the same types of people that don't want the teaching of slavery in American school systems and are trying to stop, the work of critical race theory.
Mm,
We know what resistance to the flow of civil rights looks like. And
mm,
so just stand fast.
mm,
Stand fast. It's not just you who's resisting. There are millions of people and there are millions of ancestors who also want this.
mm,
Because I think that in times that are as dire as this, there is tremendous opening for us to take down the foundations of the things that have created systems of oppression and
mm.
create the opening of the world that we want. And we are the ones that will do it. We are the ones that are going to pivot to that beautiful, bountiful, Dalit, Black feminist future. And so that's what I really hope people will hold on to, that it is a dark time, but we have hope because that hope is in each of us.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you so much, Thenmozhi. And again, folks watching this, please get The Trauma of Caste and get curious, ask questions, inquire, and particularly for South Asians of caste privilege like myself or others who have any kinds of privilege, now is the time to do the work. This is what it is. And for anyone who wants to continue to connect with you, you have Equality Labs, which is equalitylabs.org, where you do a lot of work. You can find research and also a lot of support, I think, for folks who are Dalit caste oppressed, can find community there. Is there any other way you would like us to support your work besides
Oh,
buying your book as well?
yes. Well, I would say first and foremost, buy this book and buy it for your yoga teachers and read it in community because it's a book that's meant to be bolstered by practice. And so I've been reached out to by so many sanghas and yoga studios that are reading it together. And a great time to do that is for Dalit History Month, which is in April. So, looking forward to being in conversation with you all. And, outside of signing up for our newsletter on equalitylabs.org, you can also find us on social. So you can find me personally at Dalit Diva, DALITDIVA, on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok. And you can find Equality Labs also under Equality Labs. And it's really crucial that we, are connected because, we are in the fight for our lives right now. Equality Labs is doing work not just for raising the issue of caste and pushing forward the caste equity movement, but also as South Asian identity comes under attack from the right wing, we are that pole that is hoping to steer our community towards equity and to justice and to stand and flank other BIPOC movements for a vision of the world that we want. So, just love that support. And I'm so so grateful to be able to have joined you here today for this conversation.
Thank you.
All right, Jai Bhim and Jai Savitri, everyone. Take care.